that we're behind our leaders.
Many others call ECOWAS dead and say there's no hope in reviving it.
ECOWAS from today is no longer a topic for discussion. It is in the past and we will not go back.
What if a single decision could shake the entire foundation of West Africa? What if one country's choice could change the balance of power in the region, triggering a domino effect that reshapes alliances, weakens Western influence, and pushes Africa toward real independence? This is exactly what could happen if Togo decides to leave ECOWAS. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has long been the dominant political and economic bloc in the region. Formed in 1975, it was supposed to be an engine for economic growth and unity. But in recent years, it has become a tool of enforcement, punishing its members instead of helping them. Now, Togo is at a crossroads. With the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States AES, a bold new coalition led by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, ECOWAS is facing its biggest challenge yet. If Togo joins AES, it will mark a major shift in African politics. So why is Togo considering leaving? What does AES offer that ECOWAS doesn't? And most importantly, if Togo takes this step, what happens next? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. ECOWAS was founded with a clear goal: to bring economic growth, political stability, and regional cooperation. It was supposed to create a unified West Africa, allowing free trade, stronger security, and a shared future. But over time, something changed. The promise of unity started feeling more like an illusion. Instead of serving African interests, ECOWAS became a gatekeeper for foreign powers, particularly France, the European Union, and the United States. This shift became painfully clear when ECOWAS imposed severe sanctions on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after their military governments came to power. These sanctions weren't just aimed at the ruling leaders, they crippled entire economies, cutting off trade, freezing financial transactions, and isolating millions of ordinary citizens. For these three countries, the punishment from ECOWAS felt less like a disciplinary action and more like an attempt to force them into submission. The situation forced them to ask a critical question: is ECOWAS truly working for Africa's benefit, or is it simply enforcing Western economic and political control? The answer led them to form AES, a new alliance built on the idea that African nations should take full control of their destinies. Togo has observed these events closely, watching as ECOWAS transformed from a symbol of West African unity into a political battleground. Unlike Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Togo has long maintained a stance of neutrality, choosing not to align itself with radical shifts in the region's political dynamics. Historically, it has played the role of a mediator between conflicting parties, offering diplomatic solutions when tensions rise. For years, Togo has functioned as an intermediary in West African politics. Its leadership has been cautious, preferring diplomacy over confrontation. This approach allowed it to maintain stability while other nations faced internal and external crises. When ECOWAS imposed sanctions on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Togo remained one of the few countries that sought dialogue instead of punishment. Its leaders facilitated behind-the-scenes negotiations, hoping to find a middle ground that could prevent further division within the bloc. However, the problem with neutrality is that it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when the balance of power is shifting so drastically. The moment one side gains significant influence over regional affairs, neutrality begins to look like weakness, or worse, irrelevance. If ECOWAS continues to act as a tool for foreign interests, then remaining in the bloc may no longer make sense. Togo must now ask itself whether staying in ECOWAS is truly in its best interest, or whether the time has come to seek new alliances that prioritize African-led development. Another growing frustration with ECOWAS is economic inequality. The bloc was originally established to foster trade and economic cooperation among member states, with the idea that a unified market would help smaller economies grow alongside larger ones. But in reality, that has not been the case. The economic landscape of ECOWAS is highly uneven. Nigeria, the largest economy in the bloc, dominates regional trade, often dictating the economic policies of the organization. Ghana, another economic powerhouse, benefits from ECOWAS's open markets, attracting investments and trade that smaller nations like Togo struggle to compete with. While the idea behind ECOWAS was that economic integration would benefit all members equally, the reality is that some nations have reaped far greater rewards than others. For Togo, this imbalance has led to deep-seated concerns. The country has yet to see the level of economic transformation that was promised when it joined ECOWAS. Instead of thriving, it remains in the shadow of regional giants, unable to exert the same level of influence over trade agreements, monetary policies, and foreign investments. Trade barriers within ECOWAS also remain a problem for smaller economies. While the bloc technically promotes free trade, bureaucratic inefficiencies, border delays, and regulatory favoritism often benefit the stronger economies at the expense of weaker ones. Many Togolese business owners and traders struggle with unequal access to regional markets, facing restrictions that are often overlooked by larger economies. Additionally, ECOWAS has failed to protect local industries in smaller nations. Nigerian and Ghanaian businesses have a competitive advantage in manufacturing and exports, making it harder for countries like Togo to develop their industries. The imbalance in industrial development has trapped smaller economies in a cycle of dependency, forcing them to rely on imports instead of fostering domestic production. If ECOWAS is not delivering on its original promises, then what is the point of staying? This is the point where Togo felt it must evaluate whether remaining in a bloc that continues to favor the economic elite is truly in its best interest, or if new alternatives like AES offer a more equitable and sustainable path forward. But what does AES offer that ECOWAS doesn't? The appeal of AES extends far beyond military and economic matters. It represents a fundamental shift in how African nations perceive sovereignty, leadership, and cooperation. ECOWAS, despite its decades-long existence, has often struggled to present a clear, unified vision for the future. AES, on the other hand, has positioned itself as a movement that is not just about regional agreements, but about rewriting Africa's political and economic destiny. One of the most striking aspects of AES is its rejection of external mediation in internal African affairs. For too long, major political disputes in West Africa have been settled not by Africans themselves, but through interventions by European and Western organizations. In many cases, conflicts have been escalated, prolonged, or manipulated by these foreign entities under the guise of peacekeeping. The AES leadership, particularly figures like Ibrahim Traoré, has clarified that Africa must handle its conflicts. Rather than looking to the United Nations or the European Union for diplomatic resolutions, AES aims to create a framework for resolving disputes entirely within Africa, by Africans, for Africans. This shift towards self-reliance extends into how African nations interact with one another politically. One of ECOWAS's biggest weaknesses has been its inability to prevent internal power struggles from being influenced by foreign players. In recent years, several West African nations have seen regime changes that were either criticized or influenced by Western countries. AES rejects this dynamic, arguing that African nations should have the right to determine their leadership structures without external interference. Instead of condemning military takeovers outright, something that ECOWAS has done under pressure from the West, AES recognizes that political shifts often happen due to internal failures of governance, and that solutions should be determined through African-led dialogue, not external pressure. Another key aspect of AES's approach is its emphasis on controlling Africa's natural resources without foreign exploitation. For decades, ECOWAS nations have participated in trade agreements that heavily favor European and Western corporations, particularly in the mining, energy, and agricultural sectors. African countries export their raw materials, gold, oil, uranium, and cocoa, only to buy back finished products at significantly higher prices. AES leaders see this as one of the biggest barriers to true independence. Rather than continuing the outdated ECOWAS model, where trade agreements are often negotiated with more benefits for external investors than for the African workforce, AES wants to establish resource control policies that prevent African wealth from flowing out of the continent. Some of the first steps being considered by AES members include nationalizing key industries, ensuring that African labor is prioritized over foreign corporations, and developing industrial projects that process resources inside Africa rather than exporting raw materials to be refined abroad. Togo, a country rich in phosphate reserves and strategically located along the Gulf of Guinea, would have much to gain from such policies. Under the ECOWAS framework, Togo's natural resources are largely controlled by multinational corporations with direct ties to European economies. AES, however, offers the possibility of shifting control back to local industries, empowering African businesses and ensuring that wealth remains within the region. Beyond resources, AES is also redefining infrastructure development. One of the biggest limitations ECOWAS nations have faced is the dependency on foreign loans for large-scale projects. West African nations have historically relied on funding from institutions like the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank, which often come with crippling conditions. These loans, though marketed as developmental aid, usually lead to long-term debt traps where African nations are forced to prioritize debt repayment over real economic growth. AES is proposing a different model, one that does not rely on Western financial institutions, but instead seeks partnerships with emerging global players like China, Russia, and even non-Western African economies. The bloc envisions an infrastructure development strategy that focuses on self-sustaining African-built projects rather than ones designed primarily to serve foreign investors. If Togo were to join AES, it could gain access to an economic framework that does not tie its future to the debt-heavy policies of the past. At its core, AES is about shifting power back into African hands, not just in politics or economics, but in the very mindset of how the continent interacts with the rest of the world. Unlike ECOWAS, which still operates under a system that requires external validation and approval, AES is pushing for a new African narrative, one that does not seek permission from former colonial powers. This transformation is not just symbolic, it is tangible. Already, AES members are exploring joint policies on border security, agriculture, and regional trade, all aimed at breaking the cycle of dependency that has plagued West Africa for centuries. Togo, if it chooses to leap, would not just be joining a different bloc, it would be part of a historical shift toward a new African era. The biggest question, then, is whether Togo is ready to leave behind the safety of ECOWAS and embrace the uncertainty of change. With the AES movement gaining momentum, remaining neutral may no longer be an option. Will Togo take a bold step toward true sovereignty, or will it cling to the old structures that have held Africa back for so long? The decision will not just affect Togo, it could reshape the entire West African landscape. And Togo's foreign minister has said Togo may soon join AES. But here comes a bigger question. If Togo leaves, will other nations follow? One decision can set off a chain reaction. If Togo officially announces its departure from ECOWAS, the impact will not be limited to just one country. Others will take notice, and many may begin to reconsider their memberships. This wouldn't just be an isolated political shift. It could mark the beginning of a full-scale realignment of West African power structures, something that hasn't happened in decades. Guinea has already distanced itself from ECOWAS, frequently disagreeing with the bloc's decisions. Over the years, its leadership has adopted a fiercely independent stance, resisting pressure from both regional and international players. With its internal struggles and history of defying Western influence, it would not be surprising if Guinea seriously considers joining AES if Togo makes the move. The country's economic policies have also been at odds with ECOWAS directives, as Guinea has actively sought alternatives to traditional trade agreements, looking instead toward China, Russia, and intra-African partnerships. Benin and Chad are also in positions where they could be drawn toward AES. Both countries have governments that are growing increasingly skeptical of ECOWAS policies, particularly those that seem to prioritize European economic interests over African prosperity. The more ECOWAS tightens its grip, the more likely these nations will start looking for an alternative. Unlike the larger economies in ECOWAS, which still benefit from the bloc's market reach, smaller nations like Benin often find themselves at a disadvantage, unable to compete with the dominance of Nigeria, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire. This economic disparity has led to growing dissatisfaction, particularly among business leaders who feel their interests are being sacrificed for the benefit of the more powerful nations in the alliance. Chad, though historically aligned with ECOWAS, has been facing challenges with regional stability and governance. Over the past decade, Chad's military and economic strategies have been shifting, and the country has increasingly leaned towards seeking stronger intra-African cooperation outside of Western-influenced institutions. The rise of AES, with its commitment to security-driven self-reliance, could be appealing to Chad's leadership, especially as it continues to navigate complex internal conflicts and border tensions. Even Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, two of the stronger economies in ECOWAS, may eventually have to rethink their positions. These nations have long been pillars of stability within the bloc, benefiting from trade agreements and strong foreign partnerships. However, if multiple smaller nations exit, ECOWAS could weaken to the point where staying in the bloc becomes less beneficial. The reality is that ECOWAS's strength depends on its ability to maintain a unified market. If that begins to fracture, even the strongest economies in the region will have to reassess whether the benefits of membership outweigh the growing instability. West Africa has seen major shifts in alliances before, and history has shown that once momentum starts building, it is difficult to stop. This wouldn't be the first time that African nations have redefined their political and economic landscapes in response to changing global power dynamics. During the late 20th century, the non-aligned movement saw many African nations pull away from Western and Soviet influence in favor of an independent approach. In the early 2000s, the formation of the African Union (AU) was a response to the growing realization that African nations needed to assert more control over their political affairs rather than relying on external institutions like the UN or the EU. Today, AES represents yet another defining moment, a challenge to the Western-influenced status quo of regional blocs like ECOWAS. If ECOWAS begins to break apart, the effects won't just be felt in Africa. The West has a lot to lose. This is about more than just a political disagreement. It is about the future of Africa's relationship with former colonial powers. For France, the collapse of ECOWAS, or even a significant weakening of the bloc, would represent a massive blow to its remaining influence in West Africa. France has long depended on ECOWAS to act as a buffer between African nations and complete independence from Western institutions. Through ECOWAS, France has been able to maintain economic ties, military cooperation, and political influence over key nations in the region. If AES continues to expand and ECOWAS crumbles, France will have little leverage left in West Africa. For the European Union, the stakes are also high. The EU has invested heavily in West African infrastructure, trade, and development programs, many of which depend on ECOWAS for implementation. A fragmented ECOWAS would mean that European companies and policymakers would have to renegotiate trade agreements on a country-by-country basis, significantly reducing their ability to influence regional markets. The United States, too, has a vested interest in keeping ECOWAS intact. With growing competition from China and Russia in Africa, the U.S. has relied on regional blocs like ECOWAS to maintain its economic and security foothold. A divided West Africa would create a more unpredictable geopolitical environment, making it harder for Washington to secure long-term partnerships in the region. At the same time, new global players are watching closely. China has already made strategic inroads into Africa, financing massive infrastructure projects and increasing trade relationships. A weakened ECOWAS could provide even greater opportunities for Chinese investment, as African nations look for new partners outside of traditional Western alliances. Russia, which has been expanding its presence in Africa through military and diplomatic agreements, could also capitalize on ECOWAS's decline by strengthening security partnerships with individual nations. The geopolitical implications of an ECOWAS breakdown are immense. This isn't just about a single country leaving a regional organization. It's about whether Africa will continue to operate under a framework shaped by its colonial past, or whether it will carve out a new future based on self-determination and independence. For now, Togo is at the center of this storm. If it decides to leave, it won't just be choosing itself. It could be setting off a tidal wave of change that reshapes the entire African continent. If ECOWAS survives this crisis, it will have to reinvent itself, addressing the very criticisms that have driven nations toward AES. But if it fails to adapt, its collapse may be inevitable. West Africa is on the brink of a new era, and Togo's next move could be the spark that ignites the transformation. Do you think ECOWAS can stop nations from leaving? Why is ECOWAS not changing anything? Let us know in the comment section. Is keeping doors open for communication enough? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.